Hello everyone! If you're returning to the channel, welcome back. And if you're new around here, my name is Courtney Keeley and I am the founder of Open Up. Today I'll be talking about immigrants with disabilities. Anyone who's added the intersectionality lens to their scholarship and to their day-to-day understands how multiple identities can enrich a person's experiences, but also can make them vulnerable to intolerant or ignorant attacks. Today, I want to focus on how colonial ideology and cultural imperialism have negatively impacted the experiences of immigrants with disabilities by virtue of their multiple minority status. So we'll start where we always do, with some history, so put your context hats on. Before we delve into it though, I want to give a definition for ableism so that we're all on the same page about what we're talking about. According to El Lahib, whose 2017 piece I have linked as always in the sources document, ableism is an attitude that devalues or differentiates disability through the valuation of able-bodiedness equated to normalcy. In being categorized as not normal, people with disabilities are marginalized, barred from participating in society as it is not built in consideration for their needs. In his 2008 piece, Wolbring emphasizes the importance of bringing ableism into our discussions on oppression, and underlying how it impacts everyone, not only people with disabilities. Even though this piece is 13 years old, people still don't recognize how much influence ableism has. This ableist framework is what persists to this day in every crevice of society, and the US immigration system is no exception. For this history section, I'll primarily be drawing from Douglas Bainton's chapter in the book, Civil Disabilities, Citizenship, Membership, and Belonging. According to Bainton, immigration policy has been both selective and restrictive. Restrictive policies are ones that explicitly bar people of certain races and ethnic backgrounds from immigrating to the US. Between the two types of policies, restrictive policies have gotten the most attention in scholarship, with many claiming that they were the first policies that restricted immigration based on membership in a particular group. However, selective immigration that restrict entry by people with disabilities were put in place long before restrictive policies were implemented. Bainton asserts that the scholarly neglect of these policies is rooted in the ableist idea perpetuated by the medical model of disability that disability is a personal attribute rather than part of a group identity. The selective policies in particular viewed disability as a personal affliction that made an individual undesirable for entry into the US, linking mental or physical impairment to moral wrongdoing. El Lahib echoes this sentiment, writing that immigration policies adopt an ableist construction of an ideal and normative body that immigration applicants with disabilities are measured against based on a set of criteria related to idealized notions of productivity, independence, health, and ability. Bainton talks about how people were screened for disabilities upon arrival at US ports, with many being sent back to their home countries. Many more, though, did not even make it onto a ship, as ticketing agents were financially penalized if they brought someone with a disability to a US port. To preserve their profit, they heavily screened people who wanted to immigrate to the US, with federal sources estimating that 10 times as many were refused transportation as were barred at US ports. Policymakers at the time viewed people with disabilities as moral concerns and potential public charges, and they were not subtle about it at all. That's not to say that subtlety changes the impact of discrimination, but just to emphasize that this was explicitly overt discrimination. Schweik identifies that people with disabilities were viewed on a spectrum of perception from unworthy to a threat to the nation. In his 2017 piece, Hughes attributes the morality perspective to the preponderance of the idea in Christianity that disability occurs due to moral failing. From Hughes' perspective, when disability is discussed within Christianity, It's always framed as an individual's cross to bear, and it's emphasized to them that when they get to heaven, their disability will be removed, as if removal of a disability is how you are rewarded. This idea that only perfect bodies will be in heaven puts disability as contrary to God, creating another dimension of ableism for people with disabilities, especially those who adhere to the Christian faith. Despite declarations of the separation between church and state, the ableism behind that sentiment leaches into society at large. Bainton discusses how in the late 1800s, early 1900s, policymakers identified people with disabilities as public charges. What that means, to simplify it by a lot, is that they looked at people and said, you don't fit into our very narrow definition of what it means to be a contributing member of society, so you're a burden to the state. You're not allowed to have needs, get out. El Lahib discusses how there would be cases of people coming to the US for work, and then their disability would be discovered and they would be fired because of that disability. While El Lahib points out that the disability in question did not have to impede the person's job for them to be fired, I really want to emphasize that being fired for any disability is unacceptable and ableist. To circle back to restrictive policies, I really want to explore how connected the two types were. With how I see it, selective policies serve as a bridge between ableism and racism, and that's how you get restrictive policies. Bainton talks about how people justified racial exclusion by attributing disabilities to particular racial and ethnic groups. When this has been criticized in previous scholarship, Bainton points out that it's usually to separate communities of color from the disabled community. The general sentiment is you can't overgeneralize and attribute disability to communities of color, which is true. But this is often expressed out of offense, that people would attribute disability to communities of color. The offense taken is rooted in the idea that people with disabilities are lesser than. Criticism of these policies must be rooted in the harms of overgeneralization and othering, not in the shame that society expects people to feel when being associated with disability. At the end of the day, such reactions of shame do the most harm to racial and ethnic minorities who have disabilities, who need a support system considering the amount of structural marginalization and oppression that they face on a daily basis. In their 2017 study, Mueller and Bartlett compare rates of disability to the timeline of when people immigrated to the US. As a very simplified breakdown, after the Immigration Reform and Control Act in 1986, border security tightened, deportation numbers were higher, and healthcare became less accessible for immigrants. In the study, the period after this act was passed is categorized as the most health adverse immigration regime. Conversely, the period that came before it, the limiting immigration regime, had the lowest rate of immigrants accumulating disabilities. This period was categorized by many immigrants coming to the US mainly for jobs that are categorized as unskilled, whatever that means. I know what people mean when they say it, but I don't think any job is unskilled. You know? In Altman's 2020 piece, she delves into food insecurity and healthcare access for immigrants with disabilities. She brings to light how less likely immigrants are to have access to healthcare, and also how many more healthcare-related expenses disabled households are likely to incur compared to non-disabled households. Her discussion also includes how immigrants are less likely to get food assistance. As she writes, many qualified immigrants are now afraid to receive benefits for which they are eligible due to fears that benefit receipt will hurt future applications for U.S. citizenship. This relates back to that idea of being a public charge and a burden to the state. They don't want any perception of them as a burden to negatively impact their possibility of becoming a citizen. Not having regular access to healthcare visits means less possibility for preventative care. So things that could have been addressed become disabling conditions. And let me talk a little bit more about what I just said. The condition is disabling because society is only built for very few bodies. And when I talk about preventative care, it's a problem because people don't receive it out of access concerns. It's not to say that medicine can stop impairments related to disability, but to point out that it is unjust for people to not have access to wellness resources. Next, I want to talk about the impacts of being homogenized and othered. In his 2016 piece, Watermeyer explores how the experiences of communities of color and the disabled community are rooted in the idea that they must not show distress or anger or frustration. Among marginalized communities, there's this sort of pressure that while you are rising above your oppressors, you must remain strong throughout the whole thing. And you can see it in the title of Watermeyer's piece, I Don't Have Time for an Emotional Life. This reflects the idea that success and as many individuals within a marginalized group breaking through stereotypes as possible is more important than an individual's wellness. Really quickly, take care of yourself, please. Altman also discusses supplemental income meant for people with disabilities, identifying that citizenship is a requirement, which further marginalizes non-citizen immigrants with disabilities. Now, let's address the ever-present elephant in the room, colonialism. Hey, colonialism, get over here. Not today, not ever again. Bad jokes aside, as Ella Heeb discusses, the power imbalance between the global north and global south still persists to this day. For clarity, global north is what some people would call developed countries, and global south is what is referred to as developing or underdeveloped countries. Ella Heeb claims that within already marginalized global south contexts, people with disabilities are further on the margins because of the intersection of disability with poverty, globalization, and northern dominance. The global north has largely imposed its ideas of what is normal onto the rest of the world, which completely ignores people's local realities. This is something every justice-oriented person must keep in mind when considering potential responses for injustice. The response must put the people whose lives are being impacted at the forefront of the decision-making. If you do not consider their whole lives in it, it's not going to be effective, and it is possible that it will do more harm. There is no one-size-fits-all for justice. Challenge the global north savior complex and recognize the influence that colonialism has on your views. And don't immediately dismiss that by saying, oh, I'm not like that, or I'm better than that, or colonialism has no impact on me at all. Because colonial systems are all around us, and it would be practically impossible for it not to affect you in any way. Explore the injustices that you harbor, okay? Alrighty, folks, with that reminder, that's it for this week. I would highly suggest that you give the Open Up website a visit. The transcript and the color-coded source list that used to be in the link tree are now there under the resources tab. Hang in there, you've got this, and I will see you later.